Good evening, everyone. My name is Khalil Chism. I'm currently serving as the education specialist at the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library and Museum, but I'm also an independent researcher and historian. I'd like to start by thanking Frank Wilson and the staff of the Albany Civil Rights Institute for inviting me down. And tonight's lecture is titled Emmett Till, the Selma Montgomery March and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Some historical context for our commemorations. And just by way of giving you an understanding of what you're about to see tonight, I'm a former high school social studies teacher who eventually got into museum education and public history and research. So my presentation tonight is going to be very slide heavy. You're going to see a lot of images. You're going to see a lot of documents that I don't anticipate you've seen before, and I'm hoping to shed some light on some stories that you probably at least have already heard of, you may be somewhat familiar with, but that I think you'll look at in a different light once you've seen the materials I brought for you tonight. The murder of Emmett Lewis Till on August 28, 1955. Emmett Till's abduction and murder helped ignite the civil rights movement. A month after the Till lynching, Martin Luther King Jr. stated that, quote, "It might be considered one of the most brutal and inhuman crimes of the 20th century," unquote. In fact, for most of his life, Dr. King would use the Till murder as an example of the evil of racial injustice, and he preached about, quote, "the crying voice of a little Emmett Till screaming from the rushing waters in Mississippi," unquote. Emmett Till was born in Chicago on July 25, 1941. At the age of 13, he was sent by his parents to visit his uncle, Moses Wright, in Money, Mississippi. Till was reportedly dared by some local boys to enter Bryant's grocery and talk to the white woman behind the counter who owned the store. According to William Bradford Huey, a journalist who later interviewed his killers, who are the only people who could leave us an account of what supposedly happened in that store, mind you, Till entered and touched Carol Bryant's hand while at the counter, and he whistled at her as he left the store. 4 days later, on August 28th, he was abducted from his uncle's home by Bryant's husband Roy and Roy's half-brother J.W. Millam. Till's mangled body was found 3 days later in the Tallahatchie River with a large cotton gin fan tied around his neck. He had been brutally beaten and shot through the head. His body was returned to Chicago, where his mother insisted on an open casket funeral so everyone could see the brutality of her son's death. And the NAACP and other organizations planned demonstrations following the publication of his photos in Jet magazine. On September 19th, the kidnapping and murder trial of Bryant and Millam began. Till's uncle, Moses Wright, identified the two men as the assailants, but the all-white jury acquitted Bryant and Millam of Till's murder. This image here is Bryant's Grocery and Meat Market. This is the store that Emmett was in buying bubblegum, and it was only his third day in Money, Mississippi. This image here is a ring that belonged to Lewis Till, Emmett's father. Notice the date, May 25th, 1943. I'm going to talk about this a little bit later. This ring is going to play an important role in the trial. This is a picture of Emmett Till and his mother Mamie that was taken on December 25th of 1954. That was about 8 months before he was killed. The Jackson Daily News and the Vicksburg Evening Post published this photo on September 1st of 55, the day after his bloated corpse is pulled from the Tallahatchie River. This is a telegram that was sent by the publisher of the Chicago Defender, an African-American named Robert Singstack. The Chicago Defender at that time was one of the most widely circulated African-American newspapers. And so he sends this telegram to the White House. It reads, "A Chicago boy, Emmett Lewis Till, 14, was kidnapped and lynched in Mississippi this week. Would you let us know if your office has plans to take any action with reference to this shocking act of lawlessness? Chicago Defender, 3435 South Indiana Avenue, Chicago, Illinois." Now this next letter is dated September 2nd, so it's the day after the telegram. This letter is from J. William Barber, who was the assistant to the special counsel to President Eisenhower. and he's writing in reply to Mr. Singstack from the Chicago Defender. He says, the president has asked me to write you in connection with your wire of September 1st concerning the shocking death of Emmett Till in Mississippi. We advise that the Department of Justice has been in close contact with the development of this case, but that so far their inquiry has failed to reveal any facts which provide a basis for federal jurisdiction or action. It appears, therefore, that at the present time the matter is solely within the jurisdiction of the state of Mississippi. In the event any basis for federal jurisdiction does develop, you may be sure that appropriate action will be taken. Sincerely, J. William Barber, Assistant to the Special Counsel to the President. Now, what I want you to note is the date of this document. And you note that it's actually only 2 days after Emmett Till's body has been pulled from the Tallahatchie River. So if we're to believe Mr. Barber, the federal government sent federal agents down Money, Mississippi, after having heard about Emmett being pulled from the river. They investigate and they come to the conclusion that there is no basis for them to intervene. And all of that was supposed to have happened within 2 days of Emmett being pulled out of that river. This is an image of Mamie Bradley, Emmett's mother, at his open casket funeral. This is at Robert's Temple Church of God in Chicago. And she chose an open casket saying, quote, there was no way I could describe what was in that box. No way. And I just wanted the world to see, unquote. Thousands of people attended the funeral. And if you look here, you'll notice that's the same image we saw earlier of her and Emmett from December 25th of '54. These were taken the same time. You notice he's wearing the same thing. And this is what he looked like in that casket. So thousands of people went by and saw this. Now, this is a letter from J. Edgar Hoover to Dylan Anderson, and it's about Emmett Till. On September 6th, Emmett was buried at Burr Oak Cemetery in Cook County, Illinois. Incidentally, that's the same day that a grand jury indicted Milliman Bryant, and on that day, Hoover sent this letter to Dylan Anderson, who was special assistant to President Eisenhower, and it's mainly concerning the rallying work of the Communist Party USA around civil rights generally, and Emmett specifically. Amongst the things claimed in the letter, J. Edgar Hoover says Communist Party functionaries will launch a huge campaign protesting the killing of the 14-year-old Chicago Negro boy, Emmett Louis Till. He continues, the campaign will involve a scathing condemnation of police officials in the state of Mississippi and will be designed to show that full equality for all races does not exist in the United States. He goes on to say on the second page that the campaign will involve a scathing condemnation of police officials in the state of Mississippi and will be designed to show that full equality for all races does not exist in the United States. Up here, he's talking about Claude Lightfoot, who was an African-American guy who headed the Chicago chapter of the Communist Party USA. So most of this is him describing, in his mind, the Communist Party firing up the rabble-rousers, meaning the Negroes, and he says that, and getting them upset about the lynching of Emmett Till. Apparently he thinks they needed the Communist Party to be upset about Emmett Till's lynching. And then again, he highlights the part that you want to pay attention to. In addition, Chicago newspapers of September 2nd, 1955 reflected that Mayor of Chicago Richard J. Daley had telegraphed President Eisenhower concerning this case. According to the confidential informant who furnished the information set forth above, pressure of the Negro communities on the south side of Chicago had influenced Daley to send this telegram to President Eisenhower. So, in J. Edgar Hoover's mind, it takes pressure from the Communist Party to get the Negroes to be upset about the lynching of a 14-year-old boy. And it takes pressure from the Negroes to get the mayor of the city the 14-year-old boy is from to show concern to the President of the United States, okay? Only 2 publications initially would publish that photograph. Jet magazine was one of them. This is the issue of Jet magazine that first had a story on Emmett Till. It's dated September 25th, 1955. Jet would subsequently publish 10 more issues that had a story related to Till as they followed the case as it progressed. But this was the original one, okay? This was the story. That's the fan that was tied around his neck. That's his uncle, Moses Wright. That's him, that's one of his cousins. Now, John Johnson, the publisher of Jet magazine, in his memoir, he states that he initially had serious reservations about publishing the gruesome photos of Emmett, but he did so because after talking to Emmett's mother, Mamie Bradley, he realized they had a responsibility to show people the extent of the savagery of the attack on a child. Now think about this, as a mother, to send your child home to be with his relatives in Mississippi, 3 days later, he comes up missing. He was abducted from his uncle's house. They came to his uncle's house at 3 in the morning and took him out. And his uncle stood there. It wasn't much he could do. 4 days later, they find him. She gets her son back in a box, and that's how he looks. She made the conscious decision that she wanted the world to see this horror. I want you to think about Michael Brown in Ferguson, Ohio. You may have seen some of the images of him laying on the sidewalk, but his mother didn't want people to see him that way. And so a lot of people on social media pull that image. But the police in Ferguson left him laying on that sidewalk for 4.5 hours. Half of a day. Anyone who lived in Ferguson could walk by and see him laying there. So 2 different ways of a mother dealing with the visuals of a mangled, murdered young child. This is the other paper, the Chicago Defender, that had the headline. And if you look at it, all of the headlines are related to the whole thing. If you fold it out, is about the murder of Emmett Till. Brown was the Attorney General at the time of the United States. Here's a flyer, one of the flyers. This is the Grand Rapids NAACP that put this out. So it was a protest rally, and you see the speakers were Mrs. Mamie Bradley, mother of murdered boy, and other witnesses. Here are the facts and register your protest. So these took place in different places around the country. Yes, some of them were organized by the Communist Party. This one was not. It was organized by the Grand Rapids NAACP. On 23 September, Roy Bryan and J.W. Millam are acquitted by an all-white jury after a 67-minute deliberation. One juror said, if we hadn't stopped to drink pop, it wouldn't have taken that long. Their primary defense was that the corpse couldn't positively be identified as Till, number one, and that they had in fact dropped him off near his uncle's barn after roughing him up a little bit on the night in question. That's where that ring comes in. He was able to be identified because he still had on his father's ring, that LT. Now exactly 1 month later, this letter. It's Max Robb, and he's writing to Jim Haggerty. Max Robb was President Eisenhower's first cabinet secretary. Okay, so he sends this memo to the White House press secretary, Jim Haggerty, and he's explaining why, quote, it was felt inadvisable to make a courteous reply, unquote, to anyone just yet regarding the Till case. So that telegram from Robert Singstack at the Defender that they received on the 1st, they didn't answer it. The following day on the 2nd, I didn't show you, but Mamie Bradley sent a telegram to the White House asking would they do something about her son's murder. They didn't answer it. Someone else had begun to start, other people started sending telegrams to the White House, and the White House is not answering. And so Max Robb is asked by the White House press secretary, hey, look, we're getting pressure. Why haven't you answered? So this is his answer for why he has not answered, and this is worth reading in full. He says, this wire was not answered at the direct suggestion of the Department of Justice, and he names names, Warren Olney, and the FBI, Lou Nichols, with whom I discussed this case personally. While it cannot be said openly, The FBI has definite knowledge that Mrs. Bradley permitted herself to be the instrument of the Communist Party, which seized upon the case as a cause celeb and upon her as the means of making the race question a burning issue. So the race question wasn't a burning issue. The Communist Party used Mrs. Bradley to make it so, right? That's what this letter has us to believe. Mrs. Bradley was taken around the United States by communists as a prize exhibit, and they pulled all the stops in their exploitation. While the facts in the case reflected discredit upon those who perpetrated the crime, Lou Nichols labeled Mrs. Bradley herself as a phony. And he put quotes around it to let you know that's what the word Lou Nichols used, supposedly. Any recognition of her would have been used to further communist causes in this country. Subsequently, Mrs. Bradley was discredited for using her son's death as a means of making a living. Mrs. Bradley was a civil service worker on a U.S. Air Force base. She was not using her son's death to make money. The boy's father, incidentally, was executed by the Army in Italy on a sex charge. For these reasons, it was felt inadvisable to make a courteous reply. Such a response would have been distorted to build up the communist claim that this was another Willie McGee or Rosenberg case. Okay. So it's very clear. He makes it plain. Justice for her son is not their concern. Lynchings is not their concern. Racial mistreatment of African Americans by their own government officials is not their concern. They don't want the Communist Party to get credit for highlighting American injustice. Mississippi paper says Till father executed for rape. The father of 14-year-old Chicago schoolboy Emmett Till, who was kidnapped and murdered in Mississippi, was executed for murder and rape in Italy during World War II instead of being, quote, killed in action, according to the Jackson, Mississippi Daily News. The paper said that war records show that Louis Till, 24, was executed on July 2nd, 1945. Incidentally, Louis Till and Mamie Till separated in 1942 when he left for Italy. Their marriage was over, it was dissolved. So this has absolutely nothing to do with Emmett, but we'll talk about why this comes out. The boy's mother, Mrs. Mamie Bradley, who admitted in Chicago that she received a War Department telegram and a letter concerning her husband's death, said, "I received a letter and it said that cause of death was willful misconduct." Okay. Mamie Bradley had no idea that this happened to her ex-husband while he was in Italy. She wasn't told that by the military. She found that out reading the newspapers like everyone else. Two Mississippi senators, James Eastland and John Stennis, who were apparently provided this information by someone with access to Louis Till's confidential military files, leaked this information to Southern papers. Now, the trial was already over, so why did they leak this information? This information, this particular story, it was on the front pages of Mississippi newspapers for weeks in both October and November. Bryant and Milam weren't well liked in money by anybody, black or white. Almost all of their customers were African Americans. That's who they sold to. They ended up having to close their store down. They were run out of town. They were considered to have made Money, Mississippi look bad. But as the word about what happened to Emmett began to travel around the country, then Mississippians got defensive. And when I say Mississippians, I'm talking about the heads of the newspapers. So at that point, they began to look for justification for what happened to Emmett Till. And so these two senators found out this information. Now I'm going to go back for a minute. You see that? It said, can you read what it said under there? Confidential. This was classified information. You see down here where it says declassified? This is a declassification box. That tells you when this information was made declassified. It's hard for you guys to read, but that date is January 24th, 2003. How Senator Eastland and the other senator found this information out back in 55, when this wasn't declassified until 2003. How'd they find that out? When something is classified either confidential, secret, or top secret, that means only people with, it doesn't mean only people with a confidential classification can see it. It means only people with a confidential classification who have a reason to have access to this particular series of records is allowed to see it. So someone leaked this information to those gentlemen from Mississippi so that they could leak that information to the papers, okay? Mamie Bradley doesn't know any of this is happening. No one knows any of this is happening except the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, and the agents involved. The general public, when they're reading about this, they don't know about this scandal and intrigue going on between officials in their government. So this is how history is happening in reality versus how you and I learn the history. Keep that in mind. On December 1st, 1955, exactly 100 days after Emmett Till's murder, Rosa Parks is arrested for refusing to give her seat in the whites-only section of Montgomery, Alabama city bus. In an interview she gave after her historic stand, when asked why she didn't simply get up and move to the back of the bus, she replied, "I thought of Emmett Till and I just couldn't go back." Emmett Till was very important. This is a Look magazine interview that they conducted on 24 January 1956 with Bryant and Millam, who were paid $3,800 for their testimonies. You can Google this interview. You can read the whole thing. And remember, they got off because they claimed they didn't kill him. So the jury let them go after 67 minutes. In this interview, they go into graphic, gory detail about stripping him naked, torturing him, and questioning him. There's only a few things I tell you from that, but it's very revealing to read what they say. And the interviewer, Huey, at one point questions them in such a way to ask them, you know, why are you doing this against a child? And the answer was that, oh, he was 14, but he was a big 14. He was like a man. Emmett, Bobo, as he was called, Bobo was said to be a rambunctious child. And they said in the interview, what started this is that he was bragging to, I mean, he's from Chicago, so he comes down, he's bragging to his younger cousins, he's showing them pictures of some of his classmates. He goes to an integrated school. This is amazing to them that he has classmates who are white, and it's okay. So he's bragging about it, and they say, have you had a white girlfriend? And he says, yeah, I've had a white girlfriend. And so he tells the boys he's been with white women. And so, supposedly, Carol Bryant overhears this because her husband in the interview, he says, the reason we had to do what we did to him is because he was arrogant and he wouldn't give in. And we kept asking him, so do you still say you've been with a white woman? And Emmett kept saying, yeah. Do you still think you're as good as a white man? Yeah. And he did that until they killed him. On September 9th, 1957, the Civil Rights Act of 1957 was passed. Emmett Till's murder was one of the reasons for that, and although it was primarily a voting rights bill, that's what established the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department to intervene in local law enforcement issues when civil rights were being compromised. So here's President Eisenhower signing H.R. 6127, the Civil Rights Act of 57. Here's the first page of it. Bear in mind the irony of the Justice Department under Attorney General Holder looking into the matter in Ferguson and concluding that Darren Wilson was blameless, but then coming out with this scathing report that just tears down the entire police system of Ferguson. The individual cop is blameless, but his entire department, everyone he works for, is horrible. The fact that that Civil Rights Division even exists is because of Emmett Till. Okay. Pop quiz. Which one is Emmett Till, on the left or the right? Right. So who is this? Nope. Who said that? You are correct. This is 13-year-old Tamir Rice, right? Everyone know Tamir Rice's story? He was a 13-year-old boy in Ohio who was playing on a playground with a toy gun when the cops pulled up. This is a couple months ago. When the cops pull up, and it's filmed because there was a camera there, they jump out of the car, and in 1.2 seconds, they shoot him dead. The dispatch recording, how many of you have heard that, the dispatch recording? They said to him, "We think it's a young boy and we think it's a toy gun." The officer who shot him had actually been dismissed from an earlier police department for being unstable. The officer who shot him said he looked a lot older. Sound familiar? He looked like a grown man in a boy's body. What did Officer Darren Wilson say about Mike Brown? He said he was like a monster. He said he was running away. He turned towards me. I shot him. He said he did a little hop, skip, and then he looked like he was hulking up and then charged at me. And that was believable. If you believe there's a whole bunch of suicidal young black boys running at officers with guns, something's wrong with you. That's ridiculous. Darren Wilson was 6'4". How tall was Michael Brown? 6'4". So Michael Brown is the Hulk at 6'4". Darren Wilson is the same exact size. Is he the Hulk? This recurring idea that young black men are bigger, stronger, older, more dangerous, armed, whether or not there's something in their hand, armed whether or not they are stark raving naked, like Anthony Johnson in Atlanta, who was just killed a month ago. This is a recurring event. So if we don't learn some lessons from this, that's why we keep repeating them. The Emmett Till case has all kinds of lessons for what's going on right now. Last but not least, and we'll close out on Emmett Till. There's a lot more we could say about that, but maybe in Q&A, if you have more questions, we'll talk more about the Till case. Look at this headline. Tamir Rice's father has history of domestic violence. What does that have to do with Tamir Rice? The same thing that Lewis Till being executed on a sex charge in Italy when Emmett is 4 months old has to do with Emmett deserving to be lynched, shot in the eye, have a cotton gin fan tied around his neck and thrown in the Tallahatchie River. It has nothing to do with it except if you believe that violence or predisposition to violence genetically is a thing amongst Negroes, African Americans. They're prone to violence. They inherit violence from their parents, okay? So when you read these headlines, if you don't know the history and how often these excuses have been given, these justifications have been given, they seem like anomalies to you. They're not new. This is the same thing over and over and over and over again. In 1965, at the height of the modern civil rights movement, activists organized a march for voting rights from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, the state capital. On March 7th, some 600 people assembled at a downtown church. They knelt briefly in prayer. They began walking silently 2 by 2 through the city streets. With Hosea Williams of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference leading the demonstration and John Lewis, chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, at his side, the marchers were stopped as they were leaving Selma at the end of the Edmund Pettus Bridge by some 150 Alabama state troopers, sheriff deputies, and posse men who ordered the demonstrators to disperse. 1 minute and 5 seconds after a 2-minute warning was announced, the troops advanced wielding clubs, bullwhips, and tear gas. John Lewis, who suffered a skull fracture, was one of the 58 people treated for injuries at the local hospital. That day is remembered in history as Bloody Sunday. Less than a week later, Lewis recounted the attack on the marchers during a federal hearing at which the demonstrators sought protection for a full-scale march to Montgomery. And we'll take a look at Lewis's testimony shortly. Now, even if you had no prior knowledge of this event, if you saw that film Selma, then you realize that while we commemorate March 7th, 1965, Bloody Sunday, the Selma to Montgomery March was a 3-part event, okay? So there was the beating that took place on the 7th, Bloody Sunday. And then there was Turnaround Tuesday, which was the March 9th event when Dr. King knelt down in prayer in the face of the Alabama police and then called off the march. And the final and successful completion of the march from Selma that began on Sunday, March 21st and lasted 4 days, concluded with a crowd of about 50,000 people arriving in Montgomery on Tuesday, March 25th. Pop quiz. Raise your hand if you know who Edmund Pettus is. Edmund Pettus Bridge, everyone's been there. We've been there this past year to commemorate. I see one person knows who Edmund Pettus is. Anybody else? 2 people. Okay, just a fun history fact. Edmund Winston Pettus was an American lawyer, soldier, and legislator. He served as a Confederate general during the American Civil War, during which he was captured 3 times. After the war, he was a Grand Dragon of the Alabama Ku Klux Klan and a Democratic U.S. Senator. The Edmund Pettus Bridge across the Alabama River in Selma was named and dedicated in his honor in May of 1940. There's a petition that's been circulating. It's got thousands of signatures so far to change the name of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, by the way. Okay, the 2-minute warning that was depicted in the Selma movie, I like that movie. As historical pieces go, it was very accurate. 2-minute warning, the 2-minute warning. Okay. Now more than ever, it seems to me that the bare assurance of civil rights for the Southern Negro, coupled with the assurance of the right to vote in federal elections, is not enough. In the last few weeks, we've seen police brutality enough to last for centuries. This is a Democratic senator from Minnesota. His name was Walter Mondale. He makes this statement in the midst of giving a speech on March 8th, 1965, on the Senate floor, okay? So the Senate is holding congressional hearings. I just want you to see what that looks like. He starts off, and I'm reading from right here at the very beginning. He says, in this morning's newspapers, I read with consternation and dismay the news of another shocking incident of brutality in Selma, Alabama. So this is Mr. Mondale going all the way down here. He's talking about it. And then right here, he asked that the newspaper article that he read be inserted into the Senate record, okay? So this is how the Selma events have trickled up to Congress. This is James Martin, Republican from the 7th District of Alabama, on the 15th of March. He says, more than a month ago, I stood on the floor of this House and asked members of Congress and the President of the United States to use their influence to stop the demonstrations in Selma. I said that they were not serving a purpose. They had won their point. The President assured Martin Luther King that he would send a message and legislation to Congress, and this he is doing tonight. So the demonstrations could have ended if their true purpose was to gain voting rights for Negroes in Selma. And that's the congressional record. By the way, all of these records that I'm showing you are in the public domain. And believe it or not, it takes you the same exact amount of time to find this as it does to find the latest video by whoever. You can use Google image and find these things. Most of this stuff comes from the LBJ Library, though, which is the official repository for records dealing with this event. This is the plaintiff's proposed plan for a march from Selma to Montgomery, also known as Hosea Williams and others versus George C. Wallace and others. This is a 3-page document, but I'm only showing you the first and last page. And the reason I'm showing you this document is because it reveals just how well planned the Selma March was and how meticulously it had to be coordinated with the state, which never approved of the march in the first place. So as you look at the points in here, there are other bullet points on page 2, and basically it describes the limits to the number of marchers allowed on the 2-lane portion of Route 80 East between Selma and Montgomery, which was 300. The distance to be covered each day of the march, which varied. Some days they were going to march 11 miles, 17 miles, 12 miles until they arrived in Montgomery, as well as the designated stopping points, who the owner or proprietor of each of those stopping points was, and required proof of pre-approved permissions from said owners for the marchers to stop and rest on their property. And the march organizers had indeed met all of those state requirements prior to proceeding. They had to get all of that done to even hold a protest. So I don't know if you guys know how protests happen or how they happen then, and they aren't very much different now. You would think as Americans we have the right to band together and make some signs and just go out and express ourselves. First Amendment, freedom of speech, right to petition our government for grievances. No, you have to get permission to protest, even if it's the same government you're protesting about, okay? On this last page, which is funny, look at this handwriting, you see that? It reads, Defendant Governor Wallace objects to the within proposed plan. Respectfully submitted, and that's Governor Wallace's lawyer. They want it in it, they know this is a court document, it's going to be filed for posterity. They want in handwriting, or at least Governor Wallace did, he wants it to be known for anyone in the future, in posterity, that wants to look at this event. He wants to be remembered as someone who objected to this happening. So he has his lawyer write that in handwriting. This is testimony that John Lewis gave. Now, John Lewis was national chairman of SNCC. SNCC was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. If you remember in Selma, when Dr. King and Hosea Williams, Dr. King's organization was the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee had been working to register black people in Selma for years before Dr. King even arrived in Selma. And so they touch on it a little bit in the movie, where there's some tension between SNCC and SCLC, because SNCC is like, we've been here, who are you? You know, they make the two SNCC guys look real disgruntled and look like haters, but there's a long history behind that. And if you want to know it, Google 10 things about Selma you should know before seeing the movie. 10 things about Selma you should know before seeing the movie. And this is just John Lewis just describing what happened to him during that 2-minute warning. On the same day, by the way, LBJ addressed a joint session of Congress calling for the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And they would end up passing it 5 months later in August. And this is just the visuals of the route. Let's see, on Sunday, March 21st, under the protections of the Federalized National Guard, 3,200 demonstrators set out from Selma to begin a 54-mile march, which took them 4 days to complete. This was taken this year. These are people who are at the 50th anniversary. And you see their banner. I like it. Remember, reconnect, and restore. I would add one more R to it, reconsider. What is the point of commemorating or reenacting a historic event? What is the point other than, if it's not to feel good or feel as if you're participating in a great historic event, why do we do that? Why? We already have the right to vote. There's a sign here that says stop voter suppression. So that's a current issue that we're going to touch on in a second. But what is the point? I think we need to reconsider.
You cannot afford to forget.
You can't afford to forget. That's crucial. You can't afford to forget. I want to go back and revisit what the point was of the original march, at least according to Dr. King, okay? These two paragraphs are excerpted from an article that he wrote that appeared in a Sunday, March 14th, 1965 issue of the New York Times. This was the same day that LBJ delivered that historic address where he says, "We shall overcome." So Dr. King says, voting is the foundation stone for political action. With it, the Negro can eventually vote out of office public officials who bar the doorway to decent housing, public safety, jobs, and decent integrated education. It is now obvious that the basic elements so vital to Negro advancement can only be achieved by seeking redress from government at local, state, and federal levels. To this, the vote is essential. He goes on to say more in the article, and then in another paragraph, he says, when the full power of the ballot is available to my people, it will not be exercised merely to advance our cause alone. We have learned in the course of our freedom struggle that the needs of 20 million Negroes are not truly separable from those of the nearly 200 million whites and Negroes in America. all of whom will benefit from a colorblind land of plenty that provides for the nourishment of each man's body, mind, and spirit. A vote would place in Congress true representatives of the people who would legislate for the Medicare, housing, schools, and jobs required by all men of any color. So Dr. King is under the impression that once black people are allowed to vote, what it will do is affect these aspects of black people's lives: housing, public safety, jobs, education, housing, schools, jobs, health, okay? So it's not vote for voting's sake because it's just fun to do. The vote is not the end. It's the means to the end. The goal is to improve those things. The goal isn't to vote and, whoo, I pulled that lever, I did it. That's not the point. Voting is the mechanism to achieve these things. This is courtesy of the Huffington Post. They did this about a month ago, just to kind of give us a comparison of where we were before the Voting Rights Act of '65 and where we are now. Household income in 1963, that was the median income of blacks in 2013, 40,000. This is the part that matters. Black median family income as a percentage of the median income for all American families. In 1963, it was 55, so we made a little more than half of what other people made. In 2013, 66%. That's improvement. Median weekly earnings for whites in 2014, $816. For blacks, $639. A difference of $177. We're still not there yet. Home ownership. In 1970, there was a difference of 24.2% between white and black home ownership. Whites, 60.8% of whites own homes in 1970 versus 42.6%. In 2014, the point difference is now 29.7%. So we've lost ground. What was one of those areas Dr. King said would be improved once we were allowed to vote? Has it improved or has it gotten worse? Okay. Health. Life expectancy in 1970 for a white woman was 7.3 years. She averages that she'll live longer than a black woman. A white man will average living 8 years longer. Okay, those numbers have gone down. White women only get 3 years and 4 months more to enjoy this planet. White men only get 4 years. Okay, so that has improved. We're still behind. Infant mortality rate, deaths per 1,000 live births. For whites in 1965, it was 21.5%. For blacks, it was 41.7%. In 2013, those numbers for both have gone down, so that's great. We've improved medically, just generally, our understanding of medicine and keeping babies alive. But if you look at the difference, this was almost twice, but now this is definitely more than twice. So it's gotten worse. More black babies die in comparison to white babies in 2013 than they did in 1965. Education. Percentage of blacks aged 25 to 29 completed high school or higher. In 1970, that percent was 58.4. In 2013, 90. Hey, let's clap for that one. Come on, I don't want y'all to make me feel bad. I'm bringing you the bad news. I didn't make this stuff up. So yeah, we're gonna celebrate the good stuff, right? College students, percentage of blacks aged 18 to 24 enrolled in degree-granting institutions. In 1967, there was a 13% difference. In 2012, 36.4%, so that's a 23.4% difference. Okay, so we've improved there as well. College graduates, 10%. African Americans, 1970, 20.5%, so we more than doubled. Okay, that's improvement. That's good. We can revisit this in Q&A. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the Voting Rights Act of 1965, okay? Here's your summary. By 1964, numerous civil rights demonstrations were being held and considerable violence erupted and brought renewed attention to the issue of voting rights. The murder of voting rights activists in Mississippi mainly Jimmy Lee Jackson, which you saw in the Selma movie, which precipitated the reason for them doing that march. That gained national attention and persuaded President Johnson and Congress to initiate meaningful and effective national voting rights legislation. The combination of public revulsion to the violence and Johnson's political skills stimulated Congress to pass the Voting Rights Bill on August 5, 1965. The legislation, which President Johnson signed into law the next day, outlawed literacy tests and provided for the appointment of federal examiners with the power to register qualified citizens to vote in those jurisdictions that were covered according to a formula provided in the statute. In addition, Section 5 of the Act required covered jurisdictions to obtain pre-clearance from either the District Court for the District of Columbia or the U.S. Attorney General for any new voting practices and procedures. Section 2, which closely followed the language of the 15th Amendment, applied a nationwide prohibition of the denial or abridgment of the right to vote on account of race or color. Don't worry, I have slides that'll make all of that political speak very plain for you. This is the Voting Rights Act of 1965, commonly called S-1564. You can see right there, what does that tell us, that S-1564? It tells us that the bill began in the Senate. All bills, they'll have up here either S in a number or H in a number, and that tells you which half of Congress originated the bill. So S-1564, AKA the Voting Rights Act of 1965, has another AKA. That's what we call it casually. This is the formal name of it. An act to enforce the 15th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States and for other purposes. So the thing that we call the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is really called an act to enforce the 15th Amendment. When was the 15th Amendment passed? When was the 15th Amendment passed? That's not a typo. 95 years earlier. Okay? The 15th Amendment, Article 15, Section 1 says, the rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Section 2 of the 15th Amendment says the Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So if black people already had been granted the right to vote way back in 1868, why do we have such a thing called the Voting Rights Act of 1965? Anybody ever heard of someone called Jim Crow? Right? Immediately after passage of the 15th Amendment in 1868, African Americans in the South faced tremendous obstacles to voting, including poll taxes, literacy tests, and other bureaucratic restrictions. They also risked harassment, intimidation, economic reprisals, and physical violence, up to and including death for even trying to register to vote. As a result, very few African Americans were registered voters between 1868 and 1965, and they had very little political power either locally or nationally. So poll taxes. Here's a poll tax receipt. In other words, if you were black, you had to pay to register to vote. And it doesn't seem like much, but $1.50 back then was a lot of money. In fact, here's an example of a poll tax receipt from the county of Montgomery, Alabama, for a woman named Rosa Louise Parks. 21 January 1957. Yes, that Rosa Parks. So this is one of the things that the Voting Rights Act of 65 outlawed. You remember the part in Selma where they kept asking the woman ridiculous questions? They might ask you to recite a passage of the Constitution. They would get even more ridiculous. How many jelly beans are in this jar? And if you couldn't answer correctly, you weren't allowed to vote. Now I wanted to, I was pulling documents. I wanted to find something just to give you a general idea of how different people who were not members of Congress were looking at this. This is a letter from Mrs. E. Jackson, who lived in Brooklyn, New York, to President Johnson regarding helping the Selma protesters. For those of you who can't read cursive because you weren't taught it, dear sir, for God's sakes, help these poor, innocent people in Selma, Alabama. If your voice or vote can be of service, now is the time to use it. We can't sit by any longer and watch the shocking events in Alabama. Send troops there, not overseas, and protect those people's right to vote. It's sickening, and as a mother of 4 sons, I can't stand it any longer. To think that one day my sons could lose their lives protecting those ignorant people down there is unbearable. Sincerely, Mrs. E. Jackson. Now, I tell you the interesting part of this. Can y'all see that? You can see there's some writing there, right? That's the very faint handwritten response that President Johnson writes over the top of her letter to prompt his secretary on how to respond. And what it says is, tell her I condemn Governor Wallace for his, and then he wrote for his, and then scratched it out and put ours. Tell her I condemn Governor Wallace for his, our shameful conduct in ordering use of tear gas and war tactics in Selma, and I'm conferring with the administration to punish the offenders and to prevent recurrences of the mischief. Now, here's another concerned person. This is a letter from Calvin Holcomb. Calvin Holcomb was president of the Business and Professional Men's Association of Birmingham, Alabama. He says he's writing to Manuel Seller, and what he's given a list of reasons why he's objecting. He says it is hereby received that we, the members of the Business and Professional Men's Association of Birmingham, are strongly opposed to the Federal Administration Voting Rights Act of 1965, numbered H.R. 6400, S. 1564, for the following reasons to wit. It is unconstitutional. It is an infringement on states' rights. Every time states' rights is called upon in American history, it's always regarding black people. It's like, is there any other benefit to states being independent? It is an ex post facto law by design. I know that didn't sound historically correct what I'm saying, but I've been on panels, I'll debate you with this to the end of time. I've been on Civil War panels, and when they talked about states' rights as being the cause of Civil War, it was about slavery. I've debated Civil War scholars. I love doing it. It is a summarized surrender to threats of violence and mob rule. What they're referring to there are those demonstrations. They consider that mob rule and intimidation tactics. They consider black people marching as putting unfair pressure on the federal government to do what they want them to do. They don't consider that an exercise of your First Amendment right of freedom of speech and the right to petition your government. That's not how they looked at that, okay? Those who didn't look at it that way. It is a concession to illiteracy. In other words, these people are not qualified to vote. Now, those literacy tests, whites were grandfathered in, okay? So no white man who came to register to vote was asked to quote the section 14, paragraphs 2 and 3 of the Constitution. They weren't asked that because they were grandfathered in. And then he goes on. So these are just some of the reasoning behind those who objected. So the White House is getting all this information from all different kinds of people. Finally, this telegram is sent to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Says the president has asked me to invite you to the signing of the Voting Rights Act Friday, August 6th at 12 p.m. at the U.S. Capitol. You should present yourself at the Capitol no later than 11:30. Please advise me if your schedule will permit you to attend. Bring your telegram, as it will be your admission card. You should enter the Capitol via the House wing and report to the doorkeeper's office of the House of Representatives. Lawrence F. O'Brien, Special Assistant to the President. And here is LBJ. That will be this guy. And that's Martin Luther King Jr., that's Hosea Williams, and others at the signing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. What gains did black people make as a result of the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965? Here we go. Registered voters. This is black registered voters in Alabama in 1960. They're about not quite 15%. In 1971, there's about 57%. And in 2008, So you can see it's steadily increasing. Everyone steadily increased. For some reason, Arkansas did this weird thing. But everyone increases, okay? See that trend? It increased greatly in Mississippi. Look at that. This is 2008. This is 2012. That's 2008. The gray bar is 1971. This is 1960. So obviously, numbers of registered black voters increased dramatically as a result of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. One more graphic from the Huffington Post. So in 1965, we had 6 representatives, we had 0 senators. In 2015, we have 46 representatives and 2 senators. We had 0 black presidents in 1965. We have one, yes, he, unfortunately, because of the way we set our country up, he gets to be called the black president, right? Voter participation, there was a 12.2% difference, and there was a 1% point difference between white voters who participated in 2012 and black voters. So we're at parity. We're at parity in 2012 as far as voter participation. We're at the end, so I have a homework question for you all, okay? This is your assignment. What practical, tangible, quantifiable benefits have accrued to the masses of black Americans as a result of the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the election of America's first black president? I'm going to repeat your homework question. What practical, tangible, quantifiable benefits have accrued to the masses of black Americans as a result of the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the election of America's first black president? You say, well, how would I know that? I'm giving you a hint to how to find the answers. How many of you have heard of the National Urban League's State of Black America report? The National Urban League has been producing an annual report for 39 years where they look at all the metrics of life in our country as it pertains to black people. Unemployment, housing, wealth, income, all those categories we touched, plus about 10 more. They do this very scientifically. They release this every year. The new report came out last week. This is where you find it. SOBA, which is State of Black America, I am empowered, IAMEMPOWERED.com. If you forget that, type State of Black America into Google. I did it this morning. I got 10 different articles from 10 different newspapers, 2 of them overseas. They all analyzed this report, looked at it, and then wrote a newspaper article based on what's in the report, okay? Baby spoiler alert, There's only one category in which black people improved. No, I take that back. Let me say that again. There's only one category for which black people were not at the bottom of everyone else in every category. That category was voter participation. And then they put an asterisk by it. They say the reason black people had high scores in voter participation was due to voting for Barack Obama in 2012. If not for that, in every category you can measure, black Americans are doing the worst with a black president in office. So we applaud Barack Obama when we see those numbers, and Mitt Romney said he would bring them from this down to this, and President Obama says, well, yeah, but I've done that. I brought it down to 5 point. And we cheer, but remember, that's not for us. Our numbers are still double digit, closer to 20%. I'm not trying to bring you down. I didn't do this report, but my point is when I went back to that banner and I said we need to remember, reconnect, recollect, we need to reconsider. What did Martin Luther King think voting was going to do for us? And did that happen as a result of voting? Does that mean don't vote? No. It just means there is something else going on that we need to look at. We are not making the improvements we want to make and expect to make. And what that means is we have misdiagnosed the sickness, the malady, the problem. We have not accurately figured it out. It's just like our elders would say, well, as soon as all these old races die off, racism will be gone. That's not true either, okay? It perpetuates itself. So that's the end of my presentation, except for this part. What do I keep hearing? That black people's right to vote is in danger of being overturned. What is pre-clearance? I've said the word 2-3 times. When the Voting Rights Act of '65 was passed, it wasn't like that was it and the people who were against it let it go. No, there were court challenges, 3, 4, 5 different years. There were major court challenges to the Voting Rights Act. And this is what has been, is what is at stake of being overturned. It's the pre-clearance aspect. Because of those poll tests and those literacy tests that were passed by the southern states, the federal government said, if you make any rules that change anything having to do with people voting in your state, that has to be pre-cleared with the federal government. We have to look at this rule you're making related to voting, and we have to approve it because we don't know if you're trying to do some shenanigans again. Many of the same states, these are all the ones that are subject to pre-clearance. That's what Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act is about, right? They have subsequently tried to pass voter ID laws. Their explanation is that there's massive voter fraud, and if we don't require certain types of ID, then people could just be pretending they're other people. There have only been 2 cases of voter fraud that have been confirmed. Two. And based on those 2, these same southern states, these Jim Crow law states, these black code law states, these Confederate states are trying to pass voter restriction laws. Why does that matter? Because the question of who doesn't have a government ID is answered here. 25% of African Americans, for whatever reason, don't have a government issued ID. 20% of Asian Americans don't have a government issued ID. 19% of Latino Americans, 18% of young people 18 to 24, and 15% of citizens who make less than $35,000 a year annually. So poor people. If you look at it, most of these categories of people mostly vote Democrat. So when you hear about pre-clearance and people saying, oh, they're going to overturn voting rights, what they mean is they're going to get rid of the pre-clearance requirement. And so right now these states are they're saying they only want people to have a government issued ID. What's so harsh about that? But then what rule do they pass after that? So that's what you're hearing when you hear people say the Voting Rights Act might be overturned. They're really just talking about pre-clearance, and that's what this is. And that's the end of my presentation, for real. I hope it gave you a lot of food for thought, okay? Each of these little 3 topics could have been its own presentation in and of itself. Thank you.
In the Q&A, any questions?
I have one.
Yes, sir.
You say that it was obvious that Dr. King misdiagnosed the problem. The key to these other ends clearly was not the right to vote. So in your opinion today, what do you think the key is?
Well, first of all, let me say that if I were of age to have been in the movement behind Dr. King, I would have presumed that once we got the right to vote, that those things would change as well. That's what just about everybody thought would happen, so it didn't happen. The reason that we are on the bottom of all those metrics has nothing to do with whether or not a Democrat or Republican is the president. Those are the result of systemic white supremacy. Our nation was founded so that a formula would be in place and it would be self-perpetuating. The formula is white over black. And until we approach and study and analyze white supremacy as a system, we're still stuck on whether or not individual people we know are racist, which is the baby level. You can be as nice as you want, And you can still benefit from white supremacy if you're white, and you can still suffer from white supremacy if you're black, even as the most well-educated black person, because it's a systemic problem. It's built into the system so that it self-perpetuates. And so the reason, in my opinion, we're on the bottom in all those categories, and we were on the bottom in 1960, 65, 70, 80, 90, 2000, last year, and we'll be on the bottom next year, is because it's systemic. And we are afraid of that phrase, systemic white supremacy. When we start to look at that and analyze that and study that on the campus, like we study other phenomena and break it down and change it, that's when that changes. And remember, our electoral system was set up by the ultimate white supremacists. They didn't build an electoral system that their slaves or the descendants of their slaves could vote their way out from under. They were smarter than that. The system is not designed to allow you to vote your way out of white supremacy if you're black. No, it's not designed for that.
How much support from the citizens of the United States, particularly white citizens, was there at the time of the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1965? Did majority of white voters in this country support the Civil Rights Act of 1965?
It's hard to quantify, but there was much goodwill. And I really wish that some historians would call together histories, oral histories, of whites who participated in this movement and who wanted justice for black people. Once Dr. King and others began to understand the power of visually showing injustice, then the mood of general citizens, whites in particular, began to sway so that there were lots of Mrs. E. Jacksons writing to the government saying this is horrible. But now the issue that we don't talk about is the pressure that racist whites exert on non-racist whites. You can't just be a do-gooder white in the midst of other racist whites and think you could just speak your mind. They will do something to you. Those lynchings included good white people. And so I say that to say, whatever number of white folks supported justice for black people and the right for blacks to vote at that time, that number is larger than we'll ever know because we don't know whether they spoke out about how they felt. It's one thing to be in support of something, but you know, are you marching? It's not you. You can vote. Are you gonna go out there and get hit in the head? Those two ministers, those two white ministers that were killed, they paid with their life. And racist whites did that on purpose in order so that decent whites won't break ranks. It's the same dynamic that's going on in the police forces of our country right now. Everyone says, well, those are bad apples. Not all cops are bad. Why aren't the good cops telling on the bad cops? Because something will happen to them. And so whatever that number is larger than we can imagine, but we won't know because the forces of racism and white supremacy exert real physical pressure on decent white people not to break ranks. So we don't know, but it's more than we'd imagine.
Again.
I think there's one more back there.
I want to say that I think you can speak to the fact that the media is probably one of the greatest divisive things in our community.
Thank you.
Because they seek to divide. It's an underculture thing going on. They have an agenda. Everything you hear on the news is not news. It's information that they're feeding to you to keep you on that side and keep me on this side. They give you the ooh and the ah effect, I call it. Ooh, didn't that happen? Ooh, ah, did that happen? They will search from one end of this country to the other to bring you a report on tonight's news. There's going to be a negative connotation about a particular kind of person. Things happen over in Montana I don't need to know about. Really not significant, but they will pinpoint that one, and then they'll pick one out of Alabama. And then if one happens in your neighborhood, then that's a free one. So the media has continuously been a divisive factor. And they control much more than you'll ever know. And the part of the way you feel and you think is designed by what they put on the 6 o'clock news.
Thank you for saying that. I want to end on that note. How many of you only get your news from mainstream, basically from what's on the news on TV at night or a newspaper, a physical newspaper? I'm glad I don't see those hands. How many of you get information from social media? What's happening right now is you have social justice journalists and bloggers and media feeds so that many people are, especially younger people, are getting information about events that happen before mainstream news stations even get it. And so the truth is starting to come out faster than the lies from the mainstream media. And if we had time, I would want to do a lecture to just talk about stuff that's happened in the last year in terms of what the news media says and then what really happened. Because most people, when they hear that first headline, they don't hear the correction, right? The most recent incident is the young brother in Atlanta, Nicholas Johnson, whom was killed by police. They said he jumped in a man's Maserati at the Goodyear store to get away, and they had to shoot him. How many of you heard that? You saw that? He jumped in a Maserati. The correct explanation is that he was at work at the Goodyear store. The Maserati was there to get new tires put on it. His boss hands him a service ticket and says, go out there and pull the next car in the garage. He gets in the next car, which is a customer's white Maserati. He's about to pull into the garage, and all these police cars converge on him, and he hits the gas, and he wasn't stealing a Maserati. He didn't jump in a Maserati. He was in that car because it was the next car on the service ticket. That's not the way the mainstream news reported it. And those misreportings have been happening over and over and over, including the black man in Mississippi who was found lynched 2 weeks ago. CNN leads the story with black man found hung, had criminal record from 1985. What does that have to do with him being lynched 2 weeks ago, that he had a criminal record back in 1985? Why is that the lead of the story? So thank you for saying that. Be mindful of where you get your information and how it affects your ability to sympathize and empathize with your fellow Americans. Thank you.
Again, we thank you for coming out.